sky. Look at the water, somebody's bridge, somebody's daughter. Who could have known I'd be alone crossing this bridge? Boats heading in, somebody calling, sun going down, shadows are falling, shimmering view.
Hi, I'm Ed Jaffe. Welcome back to JaffeWoodwinds.com and the Woodwind Legacy Series. Today we're at Local 802 in New York, and I want to thank the administration, and particularly Andy Schwartz, Vice President, for allowing us to use the facility here for this special video. Several years ago, I did a video with 3 conductors under the title Broadway Conductors Forum. And today we're going to continue in that light, examining the musical theater and its influence and its importance for musicians, not only here in New York, but throughout the country. And I'm very fortunate today to have the musical creative team for the hit show Anastasia with us. I've been connected with that show over the last year and realized that the people connected with the show have created a very unique situation. Besides being a wonderful musical, the feeling in the pit and the wonderful musicians we have to work with, the score, the arrangement, from top to bottom has been just the most positive scene I've had in my 38 years in playing Broadway shows. And I thought it would be good to examine how such a situation can occur and hopefully perhaps serve as a model for other situations down the line. I'd like to introduce you to our guests today, starting from my right. First, we have Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty, who are the composer and lyricist. Actually, Lynn is the lyricist, Stephen is the composer of the show. Just to give you an idea of some of their accomplishments just in the musical theater world, because all of these guests have been involved with films and recordings and concerts throughout their career, but we're going to concentrate today just on the musical theater. So Stephen and Lynn have been the composer and lyricist for such shows as Ragtime, Once on This Island, Seussical, Rocky, and of course Anastasia. They've won Tony Awards, Drama Desk Awards, Drama Critics Circle Awards, the Olivier Award, the Hammerstein Award, and have been elected to the Theater Hall of Fame. So we're very grateful to have both Stephen and Lynn here, Broadway royalty, with us.
Thanks for having us.
Where's my crown?
Yeah, he needs a crown.
Next to them is the wonderful orchestrator Doug Besterman, who is known by every musician, probably throughout the country, who's ever played a musical in the last 25 years. Just to give you an example of some of the musicals that Doug has orchestrated, they include Damn Yankees, Big, Fosse, Thoroughly Modern Millie, The Music Man, The Producers, Sister Act, How to Succeed in Business, Young Frankenstein, A Bronx Tale, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and of course Anastasia. Doug is the winner of multiple Tony Awards and Drama Desk Awards, and Doug, thanks so much for making time today. I know you're flying to LA and London and back and forth, and it's just great that you could be here with us today.
It's my pleasure.
I appreciate it. Next to me is an old friend who actually was the drummer in my very first Broadway musical some 38 years ago, and golf buddy as well. But Michael Keller has been one of the most successful musical contractors in this country for over 25 years now. Mike's had been associated with roughly 70 Broadway musicals in that time, and it would be hard to list all of them, but I'm just going to list the 10 that are currently running, 10 shows currently running on Broadway that Mike is the contractor for. They include Anastasia, Frozen, Dear Evan Hansen, Kinky Boots, Wicked, The Lion King, Book of Mormon, School of Rock, Hamilton, and SpongeBob SquarePants. So Mike, it's been a long time since we've met each other, but you've certainly had an amazing career, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and I appreciate you coming.
Thank you for asking me.
You bet. And finally, on the outside is the conductor of Anastasia, who I met during this production, Tom Murray. Tom originally hails from Chicago and has created such a wonderful environment for us in the pit every night that it's hard to believe, but musicians who've played the show for a year now look forward to coming to work still. And every sub who has come into this show says it's their favorite show to come to work for. They enjoy it. They look forward to it. this is truly unusual, and Tom is unusual in that way as a musician and as a person. He's been the conductor of such Broadway shows as Sunday in the Park with George, A Little Night Music, Nice Work If You Can Get It, Bridges of Madison County, Honeymoon in Vegas, and of course, Anastasia. He's won numerous awards, especially many in London and Chicago, out-of-town awards, the Olivier Award, Barrymore Award, and the Jeff Awards. So, Tom, thank you for coming today, and of course for continuing to lead us every night and create such a great atmosphere.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. One of the things that my website is concerned with is woodwind playing and certainly woodwind doubling, and not only the art of playing, but the ability to work as a woodwind doubler. Currently on Broadway, we're about a month out from the 2018 Tony Awards, and currently there are 24 Broadway musicals running, which create 49 woodwind chairs. Of those 49 woodwind chairs currently working on Broadway, 34 are woodwind doubling chairs. So clearly, for those who are woodwind doublers, this is a major source of income, and with the change in the music industry over the last several generations, and the consolidation, downsizing of other jobs, it is the major source of employment for woodwind doublers, not only here in New York, but throughout the country with shows that are on the road or do regional theater or bus and truck tours. So it's exceedingly important that we understand the total environment of musical theater and what it entails for a musician trained at a conservatory, playing your instrument, but now having to go into the real world and work and survive as a professional, and to understand not only what we do in the pit, but also those who we are involved with as orchestrators, composers, conductors, contractors. And so I hope we can get a little bit of that today. So I'd like to start with each of us just giving a little bit of information of how you got started in the industry in this area as a lyricist, as a composer. So let's start with Lynn and Steve, and also how you ended up meeting and being so successful together as a team.
Well, I have a past that involves a lot of songwriting. I was one of the mainstay writers on a little show called Schoolhouse Rock. I did a lot of commercials and that sort of thing, and I was writing my own music and lyrics. And in 1982, I joined the BMI Musical Theater Workshop, which is a place where you learn the craft of writing for the musical theater. And I met Stephen in 1982 in that workshop. And, we've been working for 35 years ever since. It just, we just hit it off, as they say. And, so that was sort of the year that separated my life into before, which was a lot of commercial music, and after, which is a lot of theater.
I think at that time when I met Lynn, she was already successful in so many different kinds of music, commercial writing, television producing. And I was fresh out of the conservatory at Cincinnati. And I only wanted to do this one thing. I never really did a lot of recording, or I never was in a band or that kind of stuff. I really wanted to be a composer, and I wanted to be a composer for the theater since I was 12. I wrote my first show at 14 and just started writing songs. I came to New York City as a composer-lyricist, but I was really writing by myself by default, because there weren't very many people in Ohio or Pittsburgh, that were interested in what I was interested in. So Lynn and I met at the workshop, where it was sort of like a mixer for lonely composers and lyricists. And we just, luckily, we hit it off, and I met Lynn, and we began working within my first 6 months of being here in New York City.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning. And we just didn't, the first song we wrote was not great, but the experience of writing that not great song was great.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
We wrote a second and a third, and here we are.
And look what happened.
Yeah, here we are.
Yeah, and Theater Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
It's really quite remarkable. We're going to get back to you guys a little bit later, and as far as your influences in this discipline of composer-lyricist and how that evolved for both of you. Doug, you began orchestrating in the early 90s for Broadway musicals.
I did.
And how did you get involved? I think maybe Danny Trube was one of the early influences for you.
Yeah, when I first I arrived in New York in 1986. I'm from the New York area, but I went to school up in Rochester, New York. And came here in 1986 with the intention to be involved in musical theater. It was, I did some soul searching while I was in school and thought theater is something I love, and I think I have the skills to make a living at it, and I'll just kind of come to New York and seek my fortune. And I worked as a pianist and a keyboard player, but I would just tell people that I'm also an orchestrator, and I'd like to orchestrate, and I'd have my little cassette, you know, that little device we all used to have back in the day. I had my little cassette demo of the things I had done while I was in school and other projects I had done since then. And yeah, in the late 80s, I worked on a project that Danny was the principal orchestrator. It was a theme park show in Seoul, Korea. And they hired me as a rehearsal pianist. And I wasn't a great rehearsal pianist, but I guess I was good enough. And Danny said, you know, we could use some help. And he gave me a chart to write, and then I wrote another and did a little ghostwriting for him just over a couple of years. But then what happened to me was my phone rang one morning in 1992 at 9 a.m. and it was Alan Menken. And he said, Danny had recommended me that there was a little off-Broadway show that he was doing that he needed an orchestrator for, and Danny wasn't available. And could I come up and meet him? And that was the start of my orchestrating career. And really within a couple of years, I was only orchestrating. It took about 2 years for me to make that transition. And you know, so I was fortunate to have met someone like Danny, and then that he had the confidence in me to refer me, you know, to someone who would come to really make a tremendous difference in my career.
Incredible. But the point is, you were well schooled and had the goods to deliver. That can't be understated.
I had a lot of really, really good training, and I felt when the opportunity presented itself that I was ready, or I would act as if I was ready and see what happened.
Right. Well, that's encouraging to young players and people who are in school and you know, maybe not thinking about musical theater as the direction, but we never really know what's going to happen down the line. You know, it's that Robert Frost poem, you know, which road are we going to take? And just to be open to the possibilities, and especially if you love lots of different styles of music, it's a wonderful chance
I always say it's really important to be able to recognize the opportunities when they present themselves, and that I felt that I was fortunate in that I would see an opportunity and I'd say, this one's important, I really need to focus on it. And I think having the ability to see when an important moment is happening in your life, something that could be career changing, and then to go for it, feel confident enough to go for it.
Right. Well, it's a good lesson in life, I think, for anyone in any discipline, actually.
Indeed.
You know. So, Mike, I remember when we were doing Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat so many years ago, and driving to a golf course in Connecticut, and somehow the conversation came out to, you know, what do you want to do? And you were very clear so many years ago that you wanted to be a musical contractor. I remember it vividly. I think it was a course in Danbury that we were going to. I mean, you know, we were all piled in a car, and you were very clear, and I was sort of stunned because, you know, you had been making a living as a drummer. You had been well established as a young player doing shows in town. But you were very clear. You wanted to be a musical contractor. I could not understand that at the time. I didn't even really know what that meant, to be honest with you. But and here, these many years later, you really succeeded. And so, how did that all emerge for you?
Well, as Doug was talking about having the recognizing the opportunity, I started playing shows as a drummer in the late '60s. So I was playing shows for a very long time. So when we did Joseph, and I was the in-house contractor, by that time I had sort of sussed out that I had a skill set that was more than just as a sideman, as a drummer. And it wasn't until several years later when I had worked with Marvin Hamlish on They're Playing Our Song. And I was his drummer for a while in concert, and then we were apart for a while. Late 80s, early 90s, I reconnected with Marvin. And we'd really developed a very, very close relationship. And in my course of conversations with him, I used to tell him about these aspirations I had. And he said, and I said, you know, if it's possible, I'd like to, you know, move into that area. True to Marvin's, to who he was, he said, sure. The first thing he gave me was to contract a film score for 50 musicians.
Wow.
Right out of the box. So that was the first experience I had with being that kind of a contractor. And then he did for me what was at the time it was phenomenal. He trusted me enough after I had done The Goodbye Girl for him on Broadway. He trusted me enough to give me the position of the contractor for the Barbra Streisand tour when she was coming out of retirement. And it's an amazing thing how that one credit enabled me to be able to talk to people who wouldn't take my calls before. All of a sudden, I could get people on the phone. And I've said this to other people in the past. Maybe it's a bit of an ego thing for me, but I've always felt, if you let me in the room, I think you're going to want to work with me. And that's kind of what fueled me all through the 90s, and everything just started to fall in place.
Right. It's a great success story. It's
Yeah, well,
really a lovely story.
But an important thing is that I did recognize that there was something else in me, that administrative, managerial, whatever that thing is about keeping all the pieces together, and it worked out that way.
Amazing. Well, it really is a great story. And 70 musicals in 25 years. Jesus. That's a lot.
Somebody had
That's
to
a
do
lot.
them. Somebody had to do them.
But there are 24 musicals, as I said before, running on Broadway. You have 10 of them. That's really astonishing. I mean, that's a lot of work.
It's a great deal of luck, and being able to deliver is the combination.
Well, obviously, and you have. And Tom, I know from our conversations, you also, I think, were at Cincinnati also?
No, I was in Chicago.
Oh,
I was
Chicago.
in Northwestern. Yeah.
Sorry. But you had, from what I can remember, you had eyes of being an opera conductor. So how did you
My
go
career
all
was bizarre in that I started out, I was the very first person through a new program that Northwestern was developing for double degree in music and some other field. And my other field was computer science. And I went to, I thought I was going to do opera. I knew I liked accompanying. That part I knew I liked to do. I knew I liked to work with singers. I knew I liked the dramatic component of music. So opera, Northwestern was very much a classical program at that time, so I thought opera is what I'm going to do. And I went for a summer in Graz, Austria, and I started learning the rep and meeting the people, and I realized that's not for me. And a lot of it at the time was all based in performance practice. Yeah, we never do this. It's written like this, but we do it like this, and we call it this, even though it's titled this, and there's so much to learn. And I thought, well, that's not for me. Ironically, I went into something that has almost just as much performance practice, but it's in English, so maybe that's the difference. So I gave up opera, and I thought, well, opera's not going to work out. I guess I'll be a computer scientist. So I went, and I was a programmer in artificial intelligence programming.
Now we have the connection.
I had no idea about this.
Yeah, so I was a computer programmer.
And in fact, every 2 nights, it's not Tom.
It's not me.
It's
But ironically,
Tom.
at the same time I started doing that, I had played a musical at Northwestern. I was in a research park at Northwestern. I played a musical at Northwestern. And my piano teacher at the time said, you really should think about doing that. You might be really good at that. And I thought, can't do musicals. And Lynn and Steve won't remember this, but I got called to play auditions. And I was the company that produced Ragtime was a company called Livent. It doesn't exist anymore.
I totally remember that. That is exactly when.
And I was the Livent audition pianist in Chicago. And the music director at that time had offered me to go out on the road with the show, and I couldn't do it. But I thought, gosh, I'd really like to work with Stephen and Lynn. They came in a lot, and I couldn't do it. Then through a bizarre, unrelated series of things, I quit computer science. I ended up doing musicals at Northwestern, and Stephen had a gig in Chicago that he was doing without Lynn, ironically.
Right.
Yes.
He was setting the lyrics with the director of Ragtime. They had done a musical about Gertrude Stein, and he was setting the lyrics of Gertrude Stein called Loving Repeating, and Stephen found out my name, and we got to working on that, and Lynn came and saw the show in Chicago. Yeah. And I met her, and then they invited me on the next show they were doing, which was in Stephen's hometown, Pittsburgh, The Glorious Ones. And I couldn't do The Glorious Ones when it came to New York, because I was then going to London to do something else. My career sort of went Chicago, London, and then New York. But eventually you end up in New York, as we all did. And so I got to working. My career all came through London, actually. I was doing a lot of shows that came from London, the early Sondheim shows that came from London to New York. Not the early Sondheim shows, the early revivals of Sondheim shows that came from London. I did those, and then eventually Stephen and I reconnected. And,
Well, I just love that it took us. This is our third show together, and I love that it's in New York in the Broadhurst, and it's a big Broadway musical, and you are excellent. I mean, a lot of conductors get bored quickly. They don't like the daily work. Like a lot of them, like the creative will put it together, but Tom truly, truly loves the daily work of creating music with these musicians and interfacing with these actors. And it's live theater, so every performance is different. Somebody might be sick, there's understudies coming in and out, and you just, I think you really dig that part of it.
Well, it's a little bit like what Michael said about having a particular skill set. I think one of the things I realize about my skill set is I love the day-to-day.
Yeah.
Where a lot of music directors and music supervisors get tired of that very quickly.
Right.
I thrive on that.
One of the early things you said during rehearsals to us, which took me aback a little bit, but it's absolutely has proven to be true. You said, "I love it when subs come in. It keeps me on my game."
Yeah, absolutely.
And I thought, no, never heard that before. True, though. And the truth is, just a little aside, and we'll go to some other questions for everybody, but every night, Tom says before the downbeat, "Have a good show, everybody." At intermission, he thanks everyone. At the end of the show, he thanks everyone, thanks every sub by name for being there, and has even apologized to the band when he's occasionally made a mistake. And I told some other musicians about this, and they uniformly everybody said, "Never read the manual."
I think that somehow got past me. So maybe this is it. Maybe the thing you gave me today is the.
Oh no! Don't change. Each of you is in a very specific field, even though you do other things in the industry, as I mentioned earlier. But in your specific positions that we are talking about today, as composer, lyricist, orchestrator, contractor, conductor. How does someone in your positions get hired? In other words, we'll start with the composer lyricist. Who hires you, and how do you attain that Broadway gig? I mean, how does a composer lyricist get a show?
Well, I don't know about anybody else, but in our case, we always found our own projects. The first few shows that we did, we found projects, we optioned novels, we sort of generated our own work, and little by little we came to the attention of producers. And then I think probably the first commercial show that came to us was Ragtime. And is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say 85 to 90% of our work is in the not-for-profit margin.
Right.
Like off-Broadway, regional, that kind of stuff. But Ragtime I think was the first that was going to be like destined to Broadway. That was the goal. And
I think the thing with us is that we just always pick a project that we want to do, and we don't worry about where it's going to end up. We don't think this is a Broadway show, or this is an off-Broadway, or this is perfect. We just write a show that we like, and then hope that it lands in the right venue. And Graciela Danielle, who is a wonderful choreographer, director, who we've done about 5 shows with, always says if it's good, it'll find a home. And so that's, when once you find a home with a musical and there's an artistic director involved or a lead producer, that leads to other work. Sometimes they start bringing things to you. So, it works like that. In certain cases, like with Anastasia, we did the movie of Anastasia, and we auditioned with other songwriters, and we won that. We auditioned for Ragtime and won that. So, for us, it's been all different things, but we're good at finding projects that we like.
And at that time when we were doing the auditioning, like friends of ours, they would say, you've had 2 shows on Broadway. How dare they audition you?
Right.
And I think it's like it's the old thing that we had never done either of those kinds of things. We'd never done a Ragtime. We had never done an Anastasia. We never did a big film. And it's like proving that you're the guy for the job.
Can do it.
I love that opportunity.
Yeah.
I welcomed that. And,
Right.
And it's in terms of how we met Doug. We actually met Doug just before we were working on the film of Anastasia.
Right.
Lynn had done a show with Alan Menken
Right.
At Madison Square Garden called Christmas Carol, and she said, "You got to meet this guy,
gotta meet Doug
Besterman.
Besterman."
He's very special."
Yeah.
And so in creating, and frankly, in trying to get the gig, to get the movie of Anastasia, we wrote 2 of the songs that are actually still in the show. And Doug did these beautiful demo recordings in his home studio, mock-ups, because the people in Hollywood, they have no imagination. It's not like Tin Pan Alley like here in New York. They have to hear everything fully realized, and they were absolutely beautiful recordings. And so I think it's like so cool 20 years later that we're doing the show expanded and reconceptualized on Broadway. It's great.
And Doug, how does an orchestrator get a gig? I mean, I'm sure there are many different ways that people are hired, but from what you've observed in your career, what is the typical, or if there is such a thing, is a typical way that an orchestrator gets hired for a Broadway show?
There's really 3 different people or groups that can hire me. In the case of Anastasia, it was the composer. That's probably predominantly how I get hired. As a composer will say that they want me. And there's really only a handful of people that do what I do, that are musical theater orchestrators. So I imagine that when a composer, authors, creative team are writing a show, they have somebody in mind to orchestrate the show. They're thinking about it. And so either I'm that somebody or I'm not, And so it's, we don't really, I don't go out and drum up business. I don't, I try to be seen and make myself available and meet younger composers too, because I think that's important. And to say yes as often as possible. I like to orchestrate. I like to work on new musicals. That's my favorite thing.
Yeah, you seem to be an incredibly hardworking person. I know when we were doing the initial readings in New York for Anastasia, you were also involved with orchestrating Charlie and the Chocolate Factory at the same time.
That doesn't happen often, and it did on that. Well, that's probably a whole other. We have a whole other conversation about how I did that. But let's just say I had really good support. That's really how that happened, and an incredible music team, very, very organized, and great copyists. I mean, that's a whole other topic. But but in terms of getting hired, it's the composer. And then it could also come from the producers. I'll very often get a call from producers. Generally on revivals, it's the producer who will call, because oftentimes the composer, authors are no longer with us.
Right.
And then sometimes it's the director. I'll sometimes get a call from the director.
So it's a myriad of different people involved with the discipline.
It's generally one of those.
Yeah, interesting. And Mike, from a musical contractor situation, you talked about how you got started with Marvin Hamler setting you up and all, but how do you get shows? I mean, now you're so well established. I mean,
Well, my work comes mostly from music conductors and music directors and supervisors. Sometimes a general manager will have had a good experience working with me, and they might bring me into a conversation. I know in this case, I actually met with Stephen and before I got hired. So generally, it's someone in the music team,
Yeah, and you mentioned that someone else brings you in, but that's also brings to mind from my perspective, a rather large change over the last 45 years in the musical theater world, where years ago the music contractor was the one to bring in the conductor and often even the orchestrator.
Well,
that was back in the 70s.
Well, let's remember that at one time, every musical house in the city had an in-house contractor, a contractor that was attached to that house.
Right.
So back in those days, most shows were typical orchestras with string sections, brass sections, reed sections, rhythm sections. It's changed dramatically now over the years, but back in those days, you got your work through the actual house contractor.
Right. Yeah, so and that's why they had so much control over the entire musical staff. Interesting. And Tom, what is, from your experiences, what is the typical way a conductor gets hired? I'm sure there are many different ones, like Doug has said.
It's usually 2 paths. When it's a new show, it's almost exclusively through the writers, the composer and lyricist, or the composer if they are their own lyricist. If it's a revival, it's very much as Doug said, it's through the producers, or if there's some sort of music supervisor that's above, and I'm being asked just to conduct or music direct. then sometimes it happens that way. But it's usually those two paths. Often my name might get recommended via a contractor or somebody to the writers, or from an orchestrator to the writers or something. But if they're looking and they don't know the pool or whatever, if they're from out of town. But it's usually from those two paths.
Okay.
And also, I think the other thing to keep in mind is how the music team interfaces with the rest of the production.
Yeah.
Because it's really like casting actors, like trying to, we knew who our director for Anastasia was going to be, and he's a wonderful director and very, he thinks things through, he's very intellectual, he does a lot of Shakespeare, he does a lot of opera.
Yeah.
And I thought you can't have a music director or a music supervisor who's like 5, 6, 7, 8. You know, that would not mesh with our director. And I thought we need somebody who's thoughtful, whose intellect is even, because I've seen it before. You know, where the director and the music director don't quite see the show in the same way, or even have a common language, frankly. And I've seen that time and time again. So I thought Tom was an absolute perfect match for the director, and I think that's why this production and this experience has been really cohesive.
Yeah, absolutely, and positive from day one, from the top on down.
Yeah.
And not one, I mean, from our end in the pit, not one problem. Subs show up on time, subs are prepared, the orchestra is happy, you know, no one is falling down. I mean, it's because the vibe is what?
I said, now you've done it.
But you know,
You jinxed it. Yeah.
it's funny because what I always say is, if my favorite expression in all of theater is, if you plant the seeds right, the trees will grow, or the crops
You're
grow.
absolutely right.
So as Stephen is saying, if you get the team right, and everything is then worrying about what's underneath and all that stuff, it all should work properly. It's a well-oiled machine, or it should be a well-oiled machine, and with people with the right experience should be able to make that possible. It's, as Doug says, having the right copyists and having all the music assistants and everything underneath as well.
Yeah.
To help it work.
Absolutely.
And the right musicians in the pit.
Well, it's the whole scene. It's as one. It is the true collaborative effort from top to bottom. Over the many years that I've been involved in Broadway shows, and Mike as well, I know, the size of the orchestras has changed dramatically. Minimums on Broadway are set, and in fact, we're at the Broadhurst Theater where the minimum is 12, and yet we have 13, which
And
is...
I can't tell you how hard we had to fight to get that 13th player. It's like, and you know, you go through all kinds of, I feel like I'm Henry Kissinger at this point. But you do what you got to do, but we did get that 13th player.
An extra read. So
An extra read.
Yeah, so thanks for doing that. But how has that affected your roles with the, where when I started out, certainly a typical Broadway orchestra was 22, 24, maybe 26 at times. Some larger theaters had 32, I remember. Now, 12 or 13 is considered a good-sized orchestra in most shows. Maybe not some revivals that play up in Lincoln Center, but and the Broadway theaters itself, 12 or 13 is sort of like the average on a good size for a new musical. How has that affected your jobs as composers, orchestrators, contractors, and conductors?
Well, when we first started out writing, we wrote small shows because they're easier to get produced, basically. They cost less, and particularly when you're a young writer, it's easier to get a production if it's not a huge epic thing. So our first show was 10 people in the cast and an orchestra of, I think, 4.
There were 4 in the pit.
The next show was a cast of 11, and there was an orchestra of 5. So we worked our way up.
So we went up one.
Then we wrote Ragtime. And
we wrote.
what did we do next?
My Favorite Year.
My Favorite Year,
which was 20 in the pit. And now we're, of course, like doing rewrites and talking about bringing it back. It's very exciting. And now it's like, how can you shrink down from 20? So I felt like we were getting larger for a while. Now we're shrinking
now we're
down.
shrinking. But Ragtime was probably the biggest thing that we've done. And
27.
27 in the pit. And I did Christmas Carol with Doug. And how many was that? That was
24, I think.
24, 25. And then there were like 50 on the stage or something. It was some crazy.
Well, how does that affect you as writers when you know that? Well, let's just take Anastasia, for example. How long in front of the show, actually getting into the theater, did you have the theater lined up so that you knew it was going to be 12 or 13 as it ended up?
Not until like just before, we knew it was the perfect theater. We knew the producers wanted to find a mid-sized house, because even though the show has a great sweep to it.
Right.
There are a lot of scenes that are just two characters,
Right.
three characters, a lot of very intimate scenes. So obviously we didn't want to be in a barn, where you see like the grandmother and she's like, 3 miles away from
Right.
it. So we knew that's what we were shooting for, and we knew that the Broadhurst was the perfect theater for us. But until we landed that plane,
Right. But
didn't
when
know.
you're writing these tunes and you have a sense of generally how large the sound is going to be.
There's a song called "Journey to the Past" that we've had a lot of luck with. We were nominated for the Oscar and all. And when we did that session, it was I think this film score we had like 65.
Yeah.
And so you think of it as 65, and it's like, but we're going to give you in Hartford 12. And so obviously Doug has to be very creative. And,
But interestingly, some of the bulk of the sound of the music was in that case was taken up by the vocals, where you try to build in a Russian chorus, the sound of the vocals to kind of fill in where you've lost instruments. And it's the nature of the beast now. They always want to cut some of the orchestra down from where it should be.
Well, I think the biggest burden is on Doug and his colleagues as the orchestrators, because they have to take smaller groups and be as inventive as they possibly can to get the biggest sound out of the smaller ensembles.
Yeah, none of the producers have ever come to me and said, well, we know you're working with ensembles that are half the size of what you used to, but it's okay, they can sound half as good. It's never happened, or half as full. They've never said that.
That doesn't come out of their mouths.
Yeah.
No.
So we have to, you have to have your bag of tricks of how you're gonna, and it comes down to if you write properly for the number of musicians that you have, that's a baseline. It's going to sound good, and then to make it sound bigger, there are just some tricks and things that you can learn how to do over the years to fill things out. But quality writing, and this is why I say, if you're listening, students, you have to get good training.
That's right.
It's important to have training in orchestration to know how to write for instruments, what instrument,
and to know what the instruments are capable of, please.
and how they work together, and how to write for them.
Right.
I mean,
And also to know what will illustrate the songs dramatically. So with the smaller the orchestra, the more evocative and the more
Transparent also.
transparent. But you need a cello to be the voice of this
Yes.
character. You need a trumpet to be this. It's sort of tone, text painting, I guess you would call it, with the instruments. And the less you have, the harder the orchestrator has to work.
Right. And with the diminished size of the orchestras now as compared to 30, 40 years ago, also it seems to me that we're playing a lot more than we ever did. In other words, each player, regardless of what instrument or instruments you have to account for, we're playing a lot more. I know in Anastasia, this is not to complain, but the show is roughly 2.5 hours. And I know, I sort of figured it out. The clarinet's on my face an hour and a half.
Sure. Wow. Well, clarinets, you can use them everywhere. So yeah, I mean,
Don't, it's not everywhere.
there's no time for Sudoku.
That said, I remember in my early days in New York, and I would sub in pits of some okay shows and some not very good shows. And I remember when the book scenes would come, I would see the musicians disengage. And so now that I'm working as a composer, I thought, I don't want to let these guys off the hook. I don't want them to disengage. I want them to keep, focused. So
Well, there's precedent that when I was doing some research for the book I wrote on woodwind doubling, I was reading about Robert Russell Bennett.
Oh, yeah.
And in his book, and he was doing a show, 30s, and the band at that time was, obvious. They were in front of the stage. They weren't hidden in the pits or anything. They were up front. They were totally visible. And the producer's in the back, and he sees a lot of the musicians, like the trombone players or, some of the brass players aren't playing as much. The woodwinds are playing, the strings are playing, but the brass players, and they said, well, why aren't they playing? I'm paying them the same. Well, they have to rest for their chops. He said, well, why can't they play something? Well, you want me to just have them play anything? He said, yeah, have them play. I'm paying them. So he said, well, I'll write a whole notes. And he said, write whole notes for him. And that was the thing, if you're being paid, you got to play.
do something, yeah.
So even back then, 80 years ago, it was the idea that you're there to play and we're going to have you playing the whole life. But it is true that in today's musicals, regardless of the style, the musicians are playing a lot more than they used to. The idea of a 10 or 15-minute break, guys would go outside the pit or read the papers, doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And that has changed things. How does that change things for you, Tom, as a conductor? Because you're having to be conduct a lot
You know,
more.
the biggest change, you know, what we're saying is, what I find is not only does it require a lot of Doug, it requires a lot of the musicians, not only that you're having to play, but you're increasingly having to play as a soloist. Like one of the things that's so effective, especially about the way Doug has orchestrated the piece, is it's chamber music. And and you know this because I talk about it all the time with the musicians. It's not section playing. You have to understand section playing, but you have to play like a chamber musician so you know where you dovetail with somebody else. And it requires a lot of engagement of the musician. You know, this is the first show I've done where I think everybody in the pit literally has chamber music experience. I mean,
I remember when we were finding the musicians originally, you said, this is what we have to
and we were
look for.
asking Michael, we were like, who has chamber music? Who has symphonic? You know, who has ballet experience? Right. But the chamber music is really the key because you can't hide in the weeds. You're not going to be hiding in a section of 10 strings.
That's right. And but even though our piece is very classical in nature and the way it's orchestrated, the sounds and the orchestration, there are other shows that are not like that, and yet they're still playing a lot more and soloistically. It's really so to be a Broadway musician today is it's not a cakewalk. I mean, you're really playing a lot, and you're working during those 2.5, 3 hours of the musical. And you can't hide. I mean, there are violinists in symphony orchestras, major orchestras, who are sitting in the back of the section who may have never had a solo in 40 years of a career. But that's not going to exist on Broadway in any book. Everyone is going to be heard soloistically today because of the diminished size.
It's interesting. I did a show several years ago in LA, which is, of course, a lot of the musicians do studio work and are in these huge orchestras. And their whole, what they say is their MO is to blend, to not be individuals. That's the way they get work, is by blending with the section and knowing how the section crescendos and diminuendos and what the ink on the page is. And when they came and did a musical and you're asking them to play out, it was like dormant seeds that just exploded and the flowers grew. You know, it was wonderful.
Interesting.
It was fantastic.
Yeah, they've been holding all that back for so long.
Yeah.
In hiring the personnel for an orchestra, it used to be, my perception as a player was that the contractor had total control and they'd hire you and then the conductor would accept it. It was just, that was the way things were done in those days, in the 60s, 70s, into the early 80s. My perception now is that that is not the case totally, that it's really a hiring by committee.
It's a much more collaborative effort these days. There's, on this show alone, I mean, the input between Doug and Tom and Stephen was on every chair. There was discussion about narrowing it down to the final choices. It's a much more collaborative thing now. When I first started 25 years ago, like you said, it was a much more autonomous thing. I mean, this is the orchestration, and I would hire everybody. The entire orchestra would be, in essence, my orchestra. But it's changed, and it's not just for Anastasia, it's for every show I work on now. It's much more collaborative, much more, the entire music department is much more engaged in that process.
I think that's part of the reason why we have such a happy pit.
Yeah.
I do, because some of the musicians down there we've worked with several times or a number of times, we know them, we know their personalities, they're wonderful and, not just great players, but good people, and, we all have input in that way.
Lynn, that's an excellent point, because what I learned very quickly is that you just don't always hire the best player.
Right.
Mm-hmm. You need the best player, but they have to also have a great personality. They have to have that ability to be part of an ensemble.
That's right.
Because I made a couple of mistakes early in my career just hiring great players, and it didn't work out so well, because you have to factor in the personality aspect of it just as much as anything else.
You do. We sort of, I won't say we pride ourselves, but we've been very lucky that on most of our shows, the orchestra has been so great, so simpatico, and same thing for the actors. You know, they're always a happy group. And I think a lot of it is because we know a lot of people and we say, you know, this one is great.
And you know, I can testify to the fact that at intermission at Anastasia, musicians are backstage in the little area we have, and Tom is with us.
Yeah.
And I mean, if someone walked in from the outside not knowing who was who, they would not know who the musicians were, or the conductor, who's the associate, because it's just...
I'm the one wearing the tux, so.
Bingo. Now, for musicians, young musicians coming to New York or anywhere and wanting to work in this field, you know, our bylaws here in 802 prohibit auditions per se for specific shows. It's not like an orchestra where they need a first flute and they're going to hold an audition, or there's an opening for a second cello, you know, second chair cello. It doesn't exist, at least legally, on the books in Local 802. So how should one instrumentalist coming to New York on any chair, for instance, approach any of you? What would be the way, or maybe would be helpful to say what's not the way to approach you?
Well, you know, the thing is, I get calls all the time, as you would expect, from musicians that are relocating here or have been here, haven't crossed paths with me. I get those calls all the time, and I'm certainly not ever going. Certainly for a Broadway show, I'm never going to hire someone that I don't have experience with. Okay, that's just not going to happen. Not on Broadway. I've taken my chances on tours, you know, because it's a different animal. But so when people call me cold, I never cut anybody off. If I have a moment to speak, I'll speak to anybody and give them as much advice as I can. And the thing that I advise musicians the most is you have to become a member of 802. So become a member of 802, then you will have access to all of the lists of the orchestras on Broadway. And find the people that play your instrument. Don't be obnoxious about it, but try to make contact with those people, either to just have an opportunity to sit in the pit, to look at a Broadway book, to see that's what I advise.
Or how about the idea, even, I've told this to students of mine, call them up, tell them what your intentions are, that you'd like to do this work, but you'd like to play for them, take a lesson to play for them to get their feedback.
Right. Just
to get a sense of...
Well, the way it really works is the whole layer of subs. That's really where it works, because there are so many people now who hold chairs in shows of mine that were subs on other shows.
Of course.
And that's how they established themselves. That's how they got to know me. That's how they got to know the players. And so now they have their own show.
That's also how the conductors learn about them as well.
I learn about
exactly.
people.
Right.
You know,
So I mean, that's the path that I always advise people.
Right.
And the other thing is to always be willing, like Doug said earlier, about when opportunity knocks.
Yeah.
Just always be ready. If somebody does call you, you know, even if it's not to sub on the Broadway show, to do some other gig, always be ready, because that's how you make those connections.
Right. And so what would be the best way for someone to initially meet you, obviously through being on the sub list and all that, but should they send you a resume? Or
Oh, yeah, I always take resumes.
Is that a good way, do you think? Or
Yeah.
probably better than phone calls, right? Because, I mean,
Well, like I said, if I'm not in a time crunch on something else, if somebody calls me out of the blue, I don't just like hang up on them. I just, you know, I will talk to people, you know, because I understand. Look, the one thing that's made me successful with musicians on the other side of the coin, the reason why musicians like me is that I've never forgotten what it's like to be a sideman. I've never forgotten what it feels like to pick up that phone and make that cold call. Uh-huh. And so many times I ran into a brick wall when I did that. And so I don't do that. If I can spare a few minutes, I'll talk to anybody who calls me.
that's really great.
So because that's how you get started. That's how you know.
Of course.
And you don't want to make somebody feel like they're intruding. And I'll be honest with people, if I'm in the middle of like something that's really big and I'm under a time crunch, whatever, somebody will come and I'll say, look, I can't really talk now. Call me next week.
Mm-hmm.
And if if they do, then I'll talk to them then.
Right.
I mean, look, this business is hard enough. It's hard enough,
And
it's only getting tougher.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, that's great advice, Mike. And it was a very different playing field when we were breaking in as well.
There was so much other work.
Oh, it was incredible, and you'd get called to do a Broadway show. Well, I don't know. I'm doing so much other stuff. Should I do it?
I survived. I survived the '70s in a large part doing cabaret work.
Me too. You wouldn't believe some of these club acts I performed. Like crazy stuff.
Back in the '70s, I would get hired to do a week at Reno Sweeney's or 2 weeks at the grand finale.
Yeah.
Now, if somebody gets one night,
It's a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I was like doing one nights. I was at one point subbing like I think 5 or 6 shows, and of course there's the horrible weekend where you're playing 5 different shows,
right.
like late night performances, and just hoping you remember half of the notes. And,
When I
it's
when I
exciting,
played
though.
Forever Plaid up at Steve McGraw's,
Yes.
you had already done Once on This Island, but you were on my sub list.
There you go. It's interesting because I subbed Forbidden Broadway for many years, and then it was great that our show Once on This Island broke, and then they were actually doing a parody of the show in my old job.
that's great.
That's great. One of the things that I think is great about Anastasia, and I've heard this from everyone who's come to the show, is the sound. And I'm not talking just about the orchestration or the music or the tunes, but the way the sound is felt by the audience and heard in the audience by musicians who've come, and they all remark on how natural it sounds, how acoustic it sounds, that they actually feel like it's not just the synthesized sound coming through a small set of speakers that could come out of anyone's radio or something, that it actually feels like a live presence. How did you guys attain that? Because clearly, and I know Tom is always on top of the sound people, this is coming from the top. This is not just an accident. This is something that you guys are concerned with.
Well, we've both been doing this for a long time, and even I, the lyricist, when the show is beginning to go into tech and stuff, we're always out in the house. We're listening, we're taking notes on sound, we sit in different seats in the orchestra and we listen. We talk to Tom, we talk to Doug, and just really try to get it as natural and as clear as possible. And of course, I'm always concerned with clarity because it's my words,
Right. But I mean, I've done other shows, and I've seen people go out and do that legwork beforehand, but it doesn't have that sound.
But also we have a brilliant sound designer,
Peter
Hylinski. And we met him when he was the associate on Ragtime. We worked with him on every single project we've ever done except one since that time.
Because you have a relationship.
A great relationship, and it's not just about louder or softer. I mean, he's a very creative person. He's always 5 steps ahead of you, and whenever you bring up a concern or a note, he's already come up with 3 different solutions for that. And he's really collaborative, and he's tireless. And each show has a different concept sound-wise, Like he did Rocky for us, and that was like a real rock and roll show, and Doug did that as well. And so that had one kind of sound, and then Anastasia is a totally different kind of sound, where it's like very natural, very acoustic, very European.
Yes.
And Pete's just done Once on This Island for us, which is for musicians and a lot of actors banging found objects to create the orchestration. And each of them is so different, has a totally different concept, and I think that's where the good sound comes from, because each show has its own individual signature, and that's Peter's creative work.
The nice thing about Peter is he's smart enough not to solve the problem if he realizes somebody else should be solving the problem.
That's true.
Yes.
In other words, he doesn't just say, I mean, he can lift anything that he wants, but he doesn't sort of, if we need to hear something more, he said, well, ask them to play louder, or ask them
or
to
sing
help
louder, or speak louder.
One of the things I am proudest about this show is when I go sit at the sound position, and the faders for the orchestra never move. In other words, there is no preset for this. We need more of this on this song. We need more of this on this song. Our soundboard operator says, I can do 2 things. I can turn you guys off, and I can turn you guys on to make you louder or softer. Everything else is up to you. And so when Lynn and Steve come and say, "I'm not hearing this,"
Yeah.
I know it's my job to go make sure we hear
Bring
this,
out
and whether
this or
that's
that.
talking to
Mine,
Doug, or whatever.
Yeah, it also has to do with the style of the music of the show and the style of the musical approach. I mean, some shows are more recording studio, like more of a recording studio approach where you've got and it's often like Seussical is more like that.
That's
where it was
right.
a big
Very much.
rhythm section with lots of keyboards and we had chirping birds in the orchestra, every crazy thing.
Monkey
That was so
sounds.
much fun. We
Yeah.
sampled all kinds of crazy stuff, and
That's right.
Doug put them in.
We
and,
had gorilla percussion.
We had gorilla drumming.
We did. It was me beating my chest. Somebody slowed it down. But so it's partly the style of the music and the approach that you're going for. And in Seussical, we put the horn section in another room because we wanted them contained. We wanted to be able to control them and bring them up like you would in a recording studio, like you're bringing the horns in now. And we worked with Jonathan Deans, who was like a mentor to Peter.
Peter, right.
And that was the plan from the very beginning. On Anastasia, the plan was from the very beginning, as soon as we knew we had 12 or 13 musicians, was chamber. We're going to do a chamber orchestration. And I think we had the opportunity in Hartford to test out that concept. And I think Peter also had the chance to hear the orchestration in Hartford. It was a different pit environment, but not completely dissimilar. And I have to say, when I walked into the theater in New York, and one of my jobs during previews is to listen to the sound and to at least give my opinion of whether what I imagined my work, how it was going to sound, is being represented, and could be a whole other conversation. But I heard the sound the first night, the first preview, and I said, there's nothing for me to do here. He's just got the right approach.
It sounded really beautiful.
It sounded like the musicians were playing from the pit, and somehow you were hearing them in every seat, and that was Peter's magic. And it's reinforcement. It's not an amplification of the orchestra. It's reinforcement of the sound in a very delicate way.
And we were very lucky that the director, who Stephen mentioned, Darko Tresniak, insisted that it be a very open pit.
Yeah.
Which is a huge component.
And not only from the musical standpoint of getting the sound out, but also from the fact that the audiences at the end are always coming down to the pit and thanking us, and they're so in some cases mesmerized by the fact there are live musicians there.
Exactly.
That's a very important point. Very important point. Because that's what we've lost. We've lost that connection with the fact that it's live music.
That's right.
Right. And so many shows.
The first show that we ever did at Playwrights Horizons was a show called Lucky Stiff, and there was an upstage, a hard wall, and the band was behind the wall, and the sound was coming through two little thumpy speakers, and so many people just thought it was a recorded track. They had no idea there were real people back there playing, and we learned a lot from that.
And I never that was the first time I'd ever worked with a sound designer. It was our first production.
Right.
And so I didn't understand at that point as a composer what the sound designer did and how that interfaced with the orchestration, how that interfaced with my work. All I knew is that I had worked on this show. We had worked on it together for 4 years, and all of a sudden,
it sounded like that.
and that said, that sound designer who drove me mad for the run of that show, she for many years was the head of music at a very large studio in California. So there are second acts and thirds. So for all of us.
Yeah, but that live component and just seeing the people's faces at night, when they, naturally the actors give Tom credit for a bow and whatnot. All of a sudden, there's a huge upsurge in the volume of the applause.
For the orchestra.
And you can see them all looking with smile. It's good for the musicians to feel like you're not hidden from the entire scene, that you are in some way engaged.
Right.
Even if you can't see the stage totally, I mean, that you're engaged, that you see audiences, that you see live faces.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I did a show just before this one. We were in basically a submarine. We had no connection with the audience. They didn't see us. No one would have known. And over a period of time, as the show goes on, and you know the music backwards and forwards, and it does take an effect, not seeing people's and faces and smiles. And there is something psychological that goes into that. That's a positive thing, having the band at least somewhat visible and somewhat connected to the audience that's paying.
Yeah.
You know what the beauty of Anastasia is that it's the acoustic music, but it's all of you guys have an opportunity to play as an ensemble. The thing that I feel we've lost more than anything else in our Broadway theater now is this sense of ensemble. A lot of musicians don't know how to play in an ensemble, and it's both the fact that they're used to being separated and walled off, but it's also they don't have that sense of being able to self-balance. I mean, I always talk about it, and I know I'm getting a little long in the tooth here, but when we did the Goodbye Girl, it was a 24-piece orchestra, right? Strings, reeds, brass, drums.
That was in the marquee.
Right.
Yeah, I remember that.
There was not one piece of sound proofing in that pit. I mean, the bass trombone player was basically sitting in my lap. I was sitting at the drums. He was there. The bass was right in front. And there were parts of the show that had to be loud, right? But it was like there was a sense of being able to play as an ensemble, right? And we didn't need soundproofing. We just, we played as a band. And that, to me, is getting more and more lost in our theater now. People don't understand that it's okay for it to be double F for 10 seconds. That's okay. It's not going to hurt you. But we've lost that whole sense. And I used to even see it when I used to go on the road with Marvin and go to do all the Pops concerts. Even in the symphony orchestras, they had plexi up between the brass and the
absolutely.
percussion and
It's
the
a
strings. Come on, guys. It's like, you're playing Beethoven, you're playing Mozart. It's like, it can be loud, and it's not going to kill you. We've lost that overall sense of being part of an ensemble, and that's what I really like about Anastasia.
Yeah. That's for certain, and there's no hiding, like we said earlier, and you have to come in every night, have to have a good read, and that's what you see me work at night, and filing those reads, because boy, it's so rare that you feel like you have a good one, but you know that you're going to be heard.
Yeah.
You see, if you know it's not going to be heard, psychologically, even if you have good intentions, somehow that seeps in. But when you know you're being heard and it counts, it's a hard thing just to sit back and accept, well, it's not my best tonight, I'll just let it.
Not only you're heard, but they can come down and look and see who your face is.
Yeah, exactly. But getting back to the other thing I was mentioning about the fact that we no longer take out bands for road tours and so forth, where certainly I had my first experience working on a show day after day. How does a young person today who doesn't have that opportunity to go out on road tours or travel even internationally with tours, especially horn players and so forth, because rhythm sections, perhaps they'll take a drummer and a piano player, maybe even, not so much a bass player anymore, but where do you get that experience? What would you recommend for young players who might want to do this? And they know they're not going to have the tours that I had available to me to get experience in playing shows and seeing what it was like and what do I like to do this. Where are they going to get this experience today? What are your recommendations for that?
I mean, I do think the one thing that probably has the industry that has grown a little bit regionally more than it maybe used to be because there aren't as many tours is the regional theaters are much more vibrant community, and writers are writing for regional theaters a lot more. And first-class orchestrators are writing for that. So, and a lot of communities, Chicago, San Diego, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., have these sort of great places for people to cut their teeth, start cutting teeth. What I don't really know is how they then, if they decide they want to move to New York, make that leap, because there's not the things connecting the dots, like tours moving through, that would say, hey, why don't you come this way?
Right. And that's I know when I went out on the tour, I got a chance to meet the contractor who was a fellow named Herb Harris at the time. And when I came back to town, he took me down to some recording dates to show me some of the stuff he did. He had me come into the pit of a chorus line. I started subbing there. I mean, it was sort of a natural progression, which would be hard to duplicate today.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting you bring up the pit of chorus line, because as a composer, I would study scores. But you can't get the full effect of how a show is constructed until you're sitting in that pit. Yeah. And whenever I first came to New York, I think Chorus Line had been running 7 years, And I had a friend who was playing the piano, so he pretended I was going to be a sub. So I got to go down there and sit and watch how that conductor brought it out, how the underscore worked, how it all fit together. And I learned so much in one afternoon sitting in the pit of Chorus Line than I could have ever just from studying notes on a page.
Interesting.
It's really, and it gave me a lot of ideas in my own work.
I think sitting in a pit is great.
the
I
best.
invite,
Yeah.
as you know, I have an open
Yes.
policy about students coming to sit in
Yeah,
pits.
it's been great. We've had a number of students, former students, come just to get a sense of what it's like.
I even invite our producers to come sit in pits and stuff.
I thought
And
that was
Steven
so
came and sat in
interesting.
pit,
Yeah, I
and-
sat in the pit.
I've never sat in the pit.
You never, you're missing
Can
out.
I come
sit in
You're
the
missing
pit?
out. It's the best. It's the best view of the audience too.
I'll tell you a great little anecdote. I played quite a bit at Sunday in the Park with George, because the gentleman I would sub for, Les Scott, was the assistant conductor, so I get a chance to play with a lot. And it was in the Schubert Theater, the original production, that is. And Jerry Schoenfeld loved that show. He was in the pit every week,
Really?
even if it was for just one half or a few. He couldn't get enough of it. We all knew him. He was just so. He
That's great.
loved being there.
That's so great.
I mean, it is a great thing for them to experience it, or anyone, quite
Yeah,
frankly,
yeah.
to do that. Each of you is involved with more than just musical theater, as I mentioned in the credits, as far as films, recording dates, live concerts, and other musical projects simultaneously. How do you maintain your focus to accomplish all this while you're involved with all of these situations? I mean, for all of you, I mean,
How do you?
I don't. I just, it gets to a point where you feel scattered because, you're doing, like right now, we're dealing with the Tony Awards, I'm dealing with the Spanish translations for Anastasia. We have 2 shows running on Broadway that we're trying to maintain as best we can.
And Anastasia's about to do Germany.
She's about to
too,
do
so-
Germany,
right.
and those translations are coming at me. And you have to start at a certain point, I think, trying to literally carve out time to just think, to just take a walk, to just clear all of the stuff off your desk and focus again on creating something. And it's really hard to do that because you get into this treadmill of work, as we all know. You're on this treadmill of, well, I got to get this in because there's a deadline coming. But the times that help you to focus are the times that you can just stop for a minute.
and do you do that every day? Do you take a little time?
I do it about every 2 weeks these days.
It's-
But when I can, I do.
It's definitely a challenge. I'm a Virgo, so I'm really good at lists.
Yeah.
So I actually keep lists of my lists and some lists of my lists of my lists. So I have many pieces of paper in my little
It's a
teeny
crazy time for
room.
us right now. It's just a little crazy, but I think everybody has their own way of clearing the decks.
And we were talking about a new project. We were like doing some exploratory work, and we had all good intentions today, but there were so many different issues to deal with.
Casting and
Yeah.
oh my God, when we had to
It's-
just cut through everything, and
Yeah.
then we said, oh, we have to go do Ed's interview. Now we have no time to work.
But some days, you are your own secretary and you are your own administrator, and that's just what it is. But
Yeah.
it's like the days where you can sort of like, turn off the phone and like unplug the computer and just
Great.
dream and write. They're the great days.
Yeah.
Right, the golf days.
The golf days.
Golf days. If only I played.
So Doug, certainly, as I mentioned earlier, when you did Anastasia, initial weeks of rehearsals and previews, and you were beginning with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I mean, how do you function? How do you keep it clear? And different musical styles, I mean, really
Yeah.
different. How did you manage this?
I think it's, well,
Besides the fact that you had good support teams, as you mentioned.
yeah, that's part of it. I mean, I think, well, first of all, and this is important, I think, for students who might be watching to hear, is that we're all freelancers, so we don't really have a boss. I mean, we have deadlines, and we have people that, it's very collaborative what we do, so we have people that are going to have thoughts about our work, and we have to learn to work together. But the day-to-day, nobody calls me up and says, did you put in your 8 hours today? Ever.
Yeah.
No one even knows when I do my work. It's completely up to me, and it's like a woodwind player practicing. How many hours did you put in today? Did you make your reads? Did you do your best when you're making your reads? Whatever, you have to be completely self-motivated, and you have to, you've got to be able to find those reserves of concentration and focus and energy and just interest, even on the hard days. And so for me, now I'm an Aquarian, so I don't like lists at all. I don't do lists. Although I have a little notebook that I started writing these in. You have to good advanced planning. You have to plan. You have to schedule yourself properly. And if you need to have support, orchestrators will help each other. I'll bring in. I didn't on Anastasia. I did everything myself
Yeah.
on Anastasia.
Bravo too.
Thank you. But on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I did have somebody help. Michael Starobin, brilliant Michael Starobin, who these guys know so well. And so we can, you get help. You sort of try to figure out am I going to make it? Like, these are how many days left I have to write. So it's that, and it's checking in with yourself every day and seeing, have I accomplished what I needed to accomplish to meet these deadlines that I have, but being able to be your own supervisor, to take the responsibility all on yourself and being able to manage it. And it comes from experience. I mean, the first shows that I orchestrated, there were times where I went to bed in tears, just feeling the burden of the amount of work on me, and how was I ever going to get it done? But the more experience you have doing it, and it's like subbing for the first time. You come into the pit for the first, how am I going to do this?
Right.
But the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with it, and you learn to trust your assessment of yourself, and it just goes from there. So I mean, that's how. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Mike, I mentioned also earlier in the interview, you have 10 shows on Broadway now running, and I know from talking with you, you have some other projects that you're looking at for next season and so forth. How do you manage that? I mean, to be on top of all these details for every show.
I'm like Steven. I like lists too. I make a lot of lists, and that's how I approach the work. I mean, I just know that my list will be like per show, like what I have to accomplish or what needs to be addressed on an individual show. And as you know, I now have, because he's part of Anastasia as well, I have Michael Ahrens as a full partner. So between the two of us, we handle all of the administrative stuff that goes with the different shows. But the most intense time is always when the show is in production, first in production. Once it's up and running, it becomes much more of an easier thing to manage. And then when you have a situation like with Tom, he's a great MD to have and work for, because Tom also has that kind of administrative and managerial thing. So it's like it goes kind of hand in glove.
Right. And Tom, from the conductor's perspective, musicians we see you at night on matinees conducting the orchestra, but the role of a conductor is so much more than that. I mean, right now, getting tours up for the show, casting, changing as people come in and out of the cast, as subs come in. I mean, you're dealing with so many aspects. Can you sort of enumerate a little bit of it so that we all understand what a conductor really is?
A lot of it's casting. So where I came from right before this was we're casting for the tour. We're also we're casting some replacements for the Broadway production. We're dealing with the orchestrations that they're going to be on the road and in Europe. So there's a lot. That's just in Anastasia land, and then there's some other projects that I'm being consulted about and stuff like that.
Right.
But I think part of what Stephen and Lynn had said is, for me, is key as well. It's for me, it's rest. I take 1 day a week. My thing is I take 1 day a week off religiously. So because I can work as hard as possible and feel totally out of control, that I do not have control 6 days a week, but 1 day a week I need to feel, and Doug will know, and Steve will know, I send out an email that says, okay guy, radio silence, if you need me, call me, because I'm not answering emails, I'm not doing anything else. But it puts me in control of my life 1 day a week. And if I can do that, I can kill myself the other 6 days of the week. But there's a ton of responsibilities, and at the show, at least for a music director, a lot of it is having an excellent in-house contractor who's essentially a partner with the orchestra, besides having the great band who all know how to be responsible themselves, having a great stage manager with whom I interface. And when I first started in theater, the very first stage manager I ever worked with in professional theater, she said, the key to doing this is knowing where your job ends and somebody else's job begins.
Oh, that's so smart.
And she said, don't do somebody else's job for them. And really, in some ways, that's what we were talking about. That's Peter picking up the slack and knowing when not to pick up the slack, and Doug knowing how to have people that help him schedule and all this stuff, and Michael knowing how to get the right chemistry of people so that they all work together.
It's so true. We've lost Lynn, by the way, for our audience. She had a prior commitment, and so thankful for her being here. Really, just the last question I wanted to ask is, Broadway has done very well over certainly the last decade, but certainly over the last few years, setting record annual grosses. And with 24 musicals running now, that's really a healthy amount of shows and shows waiting to come in as well. But looking ahead, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, what do you foresee from your perspective at this time for the Broadway musical? What do you see happening as a trend, if at all? And as far as employment for the instrumentalists looking perhaps to make Broadway musical theater part of their career?
I think it changes on a daily basis. I think that there's never going to be one kind of a show. Like I remember whenever people said, "Oh, it's Hamilton," and I had several people in 1 week say, "Well, we're in the post-Hamilton era," and I'm thinking, well, so what does that mean? You can only have like a certain kind of music on. I would like to think that there would be a lot of diversity, musical diversity, on Broadway, and I think the thing to remember though is, we work in this Broadway community, and it's like 10 blocks by 3, and that's not there's so many more places to make theater, to make music, and when we were working on Rocky and we were over in Hamburg, Germany, working on a new musical, it really opened my mind to that, and I'd like to think that Broadway is going to continue to survive and flourish, but there's another side of me that thinks, there are many other places to do theater and to write shows and to have, live performances, and I think a lot of that's going to be in the regional theaters.
Yeah, that's a good. I was going to say the same thing, Stephen. I think that that's really more where the future is, because I have to admit I'm rather pessimistic about Broadway in terms of what you started the question with about employment and musicians working. I think that the days of the minimums in theaters its life expectancy is getting shorter and shorter, and I think it's just a matter of time and pressure before the minimums go away. And once the minimums go away, look, there'll always be producers that are willing to do like what Lincoln Center does, right? Put up shows with 30 musicians. But then there are just as many producers who will be happy to put on a show with 3 musicians, where it really would be better served with a dozen or 15. But so I'm not in the optimistic camp when it comes to Broadway of itself, but I do agree with Stephen that I think the theater is going to have to expand beyond Broadway being the flagship. It's going to have to be more out there than.
It's just funny. I was up talking with Andy Schwartz before I came down here, the vice president of Local 802. And he was just telling me there's a new theater opening up in Babylon, Long Island. And there are about 5 or 6 theaters in just Long Island, regional theaters, that do small productions and all, but that have, employment for musicians and actors. Some of them are dinner theaters as well. But I mean, in Long Island, which is, you're within an hour of Broadway and all that, yet there are 6 theaters there now doing Broadway shows. And this one in Babylon apparently is going to be doing Guys and Dolls as their first show in this new theater. So obviously there is, there are audiences for musical theater. We don't have to try to develop in the sense of, well, where are they going to come from, like an opera, where there's a real problem there. I mean, musical theater is a very popular form of entertainment in this country and seems to be expanding. So that seems to make a lot of sense, that regional theater will perhaps be the backbone, if not the focus down the line.
I agree.
But I'm hearing Michael, because there was 1 week when we were talking about a project that we're working on, and what size orchestra it might be and what theater it might be, and I kept hearing, and there was 2 totally different producers and then 2 totally different agents that used the phrase, well, what do you expect? This is the new Broadway. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I hate the new Broadway. I never want to hear that, to hear that phrase again, like somehow, like within 1 week, Broadway had changed, and now it was the new Broadway, right, which meant
smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah, and then I began to think, well, does that harness my imagination? I can only write these kind of groove-based shows, or I'm going back to, what Lynn and I did when we were starting out, when I was in my 20s, like maybe I can get a band of 4. Ooh, got that. Maybe I can get a band of 5. And now I've hit 27 and it's going backwards. Yeah, and it's so like the new Broadway is like, how small can you do it, you know? And that really puts the burden on sound designer, orchestrator.
Yeah.
It's a
become
cliche,
much
right?
more of
And the writing.
much more of a bottom line driven business. It's
That's
more
the
about
cliche,
the
yeah.
bottom line.
It's show business, right? It's not show fun, right? But really, I mean, Tom never heard that one. It's a cliche, but it's true. And you know, I've been really fortunate in that I've gotten to do theater at a pretty high level professionally from the time I started as an orchestrator. And I really have never come across a producer who said, I really don't care about the quality of the music. You know, one maybe, not here in the U.S. I don't really care about, they do care about the quality of the music. They want it to sound good, but they also have a responsibility to their investors. They have a responsibility, they feel a deep responsibility to the people that are on their payroll every week, because if they can't keep the show open, they're all out of work. All the actors, all the technicians, all the musicians, and they take that all the GMs, the general managers, take that responsibility very, very seriously. And so we have these conversations all the time with these folks where they hear us, and you know, they would love to say, we'll give you 27. They wish they could say that and still make money and still keep the show open. So you have to keep an open mind and understand the economics of these things. It's expensive to do a musical, and musicians are on the weekly payroll. The set design is paid for, that's a pre-production budget, that's a whole different thing. Musicians are on weekly payroll. That's the number of bodies that they have to pay every week out of the money that the show made, and then they decide at the end of the week if they can keep the show open or not, and they make that decision every week.
Right,
So
but the percentage of the total operating budget of a show, the musicians. Okay, now I understand you can go by every department. Well,
Sure.
the stagehands are but the musicians are really somewhere between 3 to 5% of the total operating
the
budget
weekly
on
operating
any
budget?
show.
Yeah, well,
Okay?
I mean,
It's
but
you know, the fact that Stephen referenced earlier that how hard they had to fight to get that 13th player.
We hear it all the time. You know, we can't take the show out on the road with this number of traveling musicians because we can't afford it. You know, so you just have to take them at face value. You know, because so the point being, when you talk about what's the future of Broadway, well, it is changing, and it probably, the economic concerns probably will determine the kind of shows that can be supported by the economics. But then it does tax the creative team, particularly on the music side, to be able to create the sound of the show that's appropriate for that style of music.
And not just to interrupt you for a second, when you're studying orchestration and arranging in school or a conservatory, none of the books are telling you how to write a full musical for 12 or 13. You're writing for an orchestra, you're writing
no
for a
textbook.
big band.
Yeah.
You have to learn this on the fly.
There's no textbook for musical theater orchestration, and I've been talking about that lately with some colleagues because maybe there should be, right? Exactly,
Because even
or at
Russell-
least
right.
we should as a you know.
Right,
a
but
theater
even Russell
community.
Bennett's book on stuff, it was geared to today when he had 35 or 40 musicians. So
That's right.
The relevance to today is nil.
And it changes all the time. I mean, look at Hamilton. You know, you brought that up, but the techniques that that Alex used in Hamilton are their recording studio techniques. It's beautiful the way he did that.
Except for one thing, no reeds.
No reads. There's no reads. All right, so we'll
No
take.
good.
So edit that out. So there's technology that can be used, but that orchestration, and he'd be the first to say it, is appropriate for that style of music.
Yeah.
You know, the Anastasia orchestration is appropriate for this style of music. So
Right.
there's that. There's always that stress between art and commerce, and hopefully what comes out of it, the conflict, the catalyst. It's the catalyst to create something that's sort of new and interesting and good. That's what we're trying to do ultimately.
And the tricky thing is, you can't think of the producer as the enemy. You can't. And if you're in the commercial musical theater, the creative people, we have to really work with those producers so we can create the best possible show and best possible product at the end of the day. And sometimes if you have these big budgets and they're just throwing money at you, that's not good either. Because I shouldn't say this, but we have very good management with Anastasia, and it's produced in a way that the show can run. Where other shows that I've been involved with, the budgets spiral out of control, and you realize that there's absolutely no way that you can ever break even, let alone make a profit, and those shows don't run. You know,
And
so
then people are out of work.
And people are out of work. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, it's been an enlightening afternoon, and I can't thank you all enough for taking time from your busy schedules to do this. And I hope this will help the musical community, and especially young players who are looking towards this avenue in the industry for a career. You know, there's reality here, and certainly it's important to know what the playing field is. So, certainly, I know from having taught in university for 24, 25 years, most schools don't tell the students what the playing field is really like.
No, they don't.
Even if they even know it.
Right.
But it's important for people who are looking towards this type of work to understand what the playing field is and to be as prepared as possible. And I hope that this interview has done some of that. And if you come to New York and you come to Anastasia, please come down to the pit, say hello to us and to Tom, and tell us that you've seen this interview. It would help.
Absolutely.
And again, thank you all so much. And,
Thank you, Ed.
And
Thanks for doing this.
it's been a lot of fun, and we'll see you next season with the Woodwind Legacy Series.